Hello and welcome to this presentation. Today we seek to address the history of masks and the present influence of masquerades in the US. Masquerades have emerged across many cultures throughout history. The Venetians in this regard are well known. Through comparison, it is evident that masquerades have changed in their meaning and practice in modern American society. Masks have appeared across many different cultures across the world, often independently from one another. Each culture has its own use for different masks, but they are quite often parallel to one another. As each culture developed and began to spread, some of their ideas diffused, and the meanings behind each mask began to change as a result. The materials that have made up these different masks depended on many things: the region it was developed, access to resources, and the purpose it was set to do or the intention behind it. The materials could span between plaster, paper, wood, leather, and so many more. Masks have very heavy ties with religion and spirituality, but it can appear in different ways. While scholarly interest in masquerades and carnival jamborees have grown exponentially in the past 4 decades, the primary and perhaps most pertinent questions that have not been fully addressed in the copious literature remains when, why, and how the masquerade tradition came about. There are many theories on the creation of masquerade culture. They often start in Italy with the Carnaval di Venezia before traveling to France, where we get the masquerade. While this is most likely the creation of the masquerade ball as we know it, it is noticed that masks have appeared across the world independently and with different and unique and changing meanings. However, before we can address the masquerade, let's address the masks on the world stage. In the Mediterranean, the ancient Greeks used masks across 3 kinds of theatrical performances: tragedy, drama, and satyr plays. The performers were always masked, and there are cases of masked choruses as well. The masks that were worn by the choruses were worn strictly by all male choruses. There were choruses that allowed women to participate, but women were never performers. If a woman were in the chorus, they were not masked. But masks were not only used in theater, they appeared outside of it in the form of death masks and were used in funeral rites. However, most masks were associated with the theater above all else. Masks with similar uses did appear in Roman culture, as well as death masks. As you can see, figure 1 is a Roman theater mask, and figure 2 is a Greek burial mask. There were many aspects of Egyptian culture that had a strong connotation with death. Here, death masks were part of a funerary rite as well as cultural beliefs based on preservation so that the soul could recognize its body and become united once more. In the case of the Egyptians, mortuary practices operated on multiple levels, meaning to mediate the communal and personal experience of death and, in Egyptian thought, to transform the dead for an eternal existence. In this case, funerary art was symbolic and idolized an idea of qualities rather than true realism. The many different and distinct cultures across the continent of Africa often included distinct uses of masks. As across the continent in the pre-colonial era, diverse African communities deployed masks and masquerades for similar functions. They aided the government as an arm of the law enforcement and supported justice administrations, compelled social conformity, and fought crimes in order to maintain the balance and a more peaceful order in the world, fraught with disorder and chaos. However, there was still a spiritual element to these masks, as in several African cultures it was believed that the masks were a way for the spirits of past ancestors to interact with the physical world again. This puts an interesting aspect of most African masks, where the presence of the ancestors are the one making the orders rather than your fellow townsmember donning the mask. And when someone donned a mask, they were no longer themselves, but a person that the mask represented. It's hard to deny a call from a grave when there's a very real voice and face before you. This is also a very plausible way to promote traditional values, as it creates a cyclical system of maintaining order. Here we see 3 different masks, all from the continent of Africa. Figure 3 and 4 are both from the West African area, whereas figure 5 is an Egyptian death mask. There is a great diversity across these different peoples and how they used masks, so it makes sense that their masks looked vastly different as well. Now, on the other side of the world, masks developed completely separately, but with very similar meanings and usage. In the case of the Kawakito people, masks were a constant feature of the Kawakito ritual. The masking principle permeates the other aspects of the Kawakito. Please note that the Kawakito people are a tribe living in the western coast of modern-day British Columbia in Canada. In this tribe, masks represent the animal skins that the ancestors and founders of the tribe had shed in order to become human and actually found the tribe of humans. This gave the mask a very heavy association with the religion of these people, not unlike others that we have heard of. These masks also have heavy correlation with personal identity, and donning them gifted the wearer the public identity of the ancestor the mask represented. Many Kawakito masks open up to reveal a second mask underneath, whereas the first mask was that of the soul of the wearer. Additionally, the masks of the Kawakito people were often associated with specific costumes, making them part of an ensemble. And moving on to a different Native American group, this time in Mesoamerica, in the case of the ancient Aztecs of Mexico people, they also had masks present in their culture. These were used in the relation to the worshipping of the dead. However, these masks were placed on display rather than being worn by living people. Masks were held as a symbol of ritual and death. Many masking practices in the Americas are hard to find the true origins of. This is mostly due to colonialism and the overtaking and erasure of the original culture. Due to colonialism, it is incredibly difficult to point out to a clear indicator of when masquerade-like celebrations and parades in the Caribbean was developed and where it came from. However, it is very important to point out that there was a culture around it. Here you can see figure 6 is an Kawakito, and it is a, quote, transformation mask, end quote, which means that you see it split open, so that second inner mask that you see on display now is the soul of the wearer, but the split mask is the ancestor which they represent. Figure 7 is a death mask from the ancient Aztecs. As you see, its eyes are closed. Moving on to Asian masks. Masks across Asia were very strongly associated with the diverse and very old theater across the continent, but there is a plethora of different forms of masks, both religious and theatrical. These masks often feature archetypical features to suit their purposes. In Japan, No and Kabuki theater both feature masks. Across India, masks were used as religious portrayals in theater, with very distinct color rules regarding what is divine, what is mortal, what is demonic. The Chinese opera has often featured masks as well, and in the Philippines, masks has been deployed in many uses but are especially commonly used in festivals. Here we see figure 8, a no mask. These masks aren't as elaborate as some of the other theatrical masks, but they have a very distinct look. If you look closely to the side, you may be able to see in the way in which this mask was attached to the wearer and how they might see and talk through it. Before becoming Christianized Europe, had a vast amount of different religious practices across it. However, after the rise of Christianity, their past culture shifted, and to continue under Christianity, it had to change. This resulted in several different kinds of processions that might occur annually. One I wish to draw attention to is the European mummers. Despite this shift, these processions were often banned by the church or the monarch, giving these masks to these performers two purposes. representing the culture they came from, as well as the anonymity of going against the law. It is thought that the Greek satyr plays likely influenced the European mummers. The mummers and their masks were a way for the old culture to persevere, as well as showing the evolution of masks and how masking changes to fit the societies it resides in. These mummer masks were a show of theater and religious practices, but lack a connotation with death that some of the other masks, like the Greek and Romans. Here in figures 9 and 10, we see artistic portrayals of mummers. Mummers and mummer plays were often a way to welcome the different holidays and seasons. Groups of mummers would travel in costume together from house to house, sing their plays and songs while asking for food and drink. The mummer masks are still present in England and Irish traditions today, taking on the form of conical straw masks. The culture around them nowadays is similar to that of pantomimes. Finally, onto the main culture of discussion, the Venetians. The ones where the masquerading culture that we know in the modern US comes from, allegedly. Masks are seen across Venetian culture in paintings and costumes, and are often synonymous with commedia dell'arte figures. The use of masks in arts, however, was a little more controversial compared to other forms. There was a certain amount of dissonance, and it was looked down upon as the Venetians distanced themselves from dell'arte figures. That was, using these masks and paintings clouded the clarity and the message the artists were trying to convey. When people don't get art, it's often because they don't understand the meaning of the piece they're looking at. It's also safe to say that when people don't understand something, they often don't like it, and so a distaste grows in its place. Reference is a difficult issue for art in general, since any representation entails a certain gap between the sign and the thing, event, or other sign that it tries to make present. The commedia dell'arte masks were so imbued with Venetian culture that at one point it posed a threat to it and prevented it from developing past itself. As we know, in the present though, this did not happen, and the masks adapted to a new place in Venice. However, at one point, these were the masks to be, so before talking about Carnaval di Venezia, let's discuss some commedia dell'arte. The commedia figures were part of a system of masks, and there were many different kinds of masks. The problem around these masks were very clear in theater at the time, as new theater styles were developed and old actors passed away, and the distance between their symbols and references became very noticeable. Customs and values inscribed in character images during the time of their constitution tend to change. These masks were made of leather and had been shaped and painted to portray many emotions with one face. Despite being constantly still, and the physicality of an actor and the scenes they emerged in would change the expression of the mask. Despite the struggle with the figures of commedia dell'arte masks were still held on to, and their practice began to change. Even as commedia dell'arte began to struggle with its place amongst the Venetians, other masking practices occurred. For example, the often use of masks and the festivities continued all year round until restrictions were placed to maintain order. This is where our Venetian masquerades become apparent. Italian masks took a departure from religious observances of the seasons and harvests that were seen in the rest of Europe. The mask became a celebration of nothing more than being human, and a large departure in the world where masks originated in rites and practices. Carnival Battua. The masks and dominos, which are another kind of mask, and the kind that most people think of when they think of a masquerade mask in the modern sense, used in carnivals in Venice, were different from those used in the arts. They coexisted. However, while commedia dell'arte had more relevance, these masks were absorbed into life. The bautas and dominos were meant to completely erase the particular identity of the wearer and allow them to do practically anything in the festivities of the carnival, especially things that they would not be able to do due to the power confines and social expectations. Why Venice? Venice was an important center for pigment trade. It also had a very important role within the art world and trade world. They were so specialized in the high quality of many of their products that painting supplies were sold by specialists, vendicolori, who only dealt in painting and related trades. The vendicolori were a part of a complex guild structure. When new markets came in, new guilds would emerge either by a new guild arising completely or by an already existing one subdividing. This high-quality center for art supplies easily fed the growing artistic creations of the Venetian Renaissance. In Figure 12, you will see some Venetian masks, and these are the Beatas in question. They are a white plaster mask with almost a beak-like feature, but this is to allow the wearer to still eat and drink while still hiding their face. The culture surrounding masks. Venetian masks start off in a social tradition and were key in Carnival, which was a celebration before Lent and the days leading up to Lent in which the extravagance would escalate. In the 18th century, masks were the norm in Venice, and they ranged well beyond Carnival season for occasions that were far from festive. This was due in part because masquerades were being hosted all year round, and contrasting some masks used as a method of controlling government and society, these masks were starting to become a disruptor. As an accepted article of clothing, the mask was simple, cheap, and easy to wear. It was not a luxury item or an exotic fashion. This is mostly in reference to the baotao, which was a simple white mask that came out from the face to still allow the wearer to eat and drink, as I mentioned before, and enjoy the festivities like anyone else. These masks were often made from plaster and were very simple to form and shape, as seen in Figure 12 on the slide before. Not the traditional colorful carnival masks of the harlequin, lawyer, dotaire, or capitino since the late Middle Ages, nor the grotesque half masks of the actors of the Commedia dell'arte since the 16th century. These were used to emphasize character, or exaggerate certain features, and they did not primarily serve to anonymize. The austere white mask that is meant here is often depicted in paintings of the Contatello from 1697 to 1768, Pietro Longhi from 1702 to 1785, and Francesco Gardi, 1712 to 1793. The so-called Beata enabled its bearer to mind his or her own business. This enabled anyone to enjoy the festivities, and as these were social rules that everyone else adhered to. Masks and death. Masks have a heavy relationship with death. Whether they were for burial or for remembrance, it was fairly common for masks to be used in rituals regarding death, funerals, burials, and history. In Europe, masks were buried and preserved to use later in order to acknowledge ancestors. This is similar to how masks were used in Greece and Rome outside of theater. Despite both Aztec and Egyptian mask culture revolving around death and religious practices, Aztec masks differ by the fact that they represent the figure in a state of death rather than a state of life, a chief detail being the open versus closed eyes. While this is because of the different cultural beliefs of the two groups, it ultimately affects how it's used. In both African cultures and Native American cultures, we see a large association between masks and ancestors, as well as the removal and placement of the personal identity of the wearer. When the Black Death came, the Bauta became a way to represent the previous rituals that nobles held, which was the ritual of taking death masks from the deceased. They would normally wear the mask of the ancestors who otherwise were on display in the atrium at the funeral. While not discussed in detail, it is worth mentioning here the iconic plague doctor mask that came about. It is known that the original masks did not quite look the way we think of them now, but the beak comes from the look that the original masks had because of the herbs and oils that were placed in front of the mask and mouth and nose to keep the bad air from entering the body, now commonly known
iconographic marker for death, illness, and general bad omens, these masks existed alongside the mummers, and their animal-like appearance bears their only similarity. Masks as celebrations and entertainment. There are many things in which masks are used as entertainment, such as festivals, rituals, and parties. In fact, this is how they are often used in the modern sense. Religious rites. There were many ancient and cultural usages of masks. Many masks were used in religious rites to emulate spirits and gods, such as in certain Egyptian rituals, where a priest might don the mask with the head of the god. Even if a gathering was religious, they could still be done in a theatric way and make them quite entertaining. Masks could be used to portray gods and demons and showcase them in a spectacle. It is the same way images and art are meant to capture a story, whether on an ancient Athenian vase or on a canvas from Venice. Theater. There was no acting without masks, and no masks without acting. Many masked theater is said to have come from religious rites being banned or looked down upon, and so the art shifted from something within the new social parameters, especially to win the approval of the church. When masks are intertwined with a culture, as they so often are, it is no wonder that they find their ways to the art sphere. Greek satyr plays likely influenced the European mummers, both stemming from a need for comedic relief and a reminder of the frivolity parts of life. Additionally, both of those plays were often under the watchful eye of the reigning religion to keep them in check. Carnival versus masquerades. Italian masks were part of an ensemble with matching beats and showcased many bright colors. These masks appeared both on and off stage. While many of the population opted for a white piazza because it was accessible, and later on in Venetian history, the extravagance of masks and costumes in these celebrations increased significantly. Here, it is good to also note that the Carnival was a masked festival, and it was public, monitored, and expected in many European countries. Masquerades are the popularization of the private masked parties that the Italian nobility threw all year round to avoid limitation. Masquerades were parties, which meant that there wasn't necessarily a reason to have them, unlike Carnival, which was a celebration. This exclusivity is what made masquerades, in the sense, catch on and become romanticized and distorted as they did. Masks globally. As is clear, masks have appeared across many different cultures in many different times. When we see masks, we see them emerge in societies with a heavy cultural concept of souls and personal identity. Western masks often focus on the eyes, but also use costumes to further the idea of creating a new identity. Western masks aren't the only ones that rely on ensembles, but when we see an attempt to recreate a masquerade in the current time, they often follow this pattern. While the way mask portrayed souls is different than it used to be, what they still do is the same. Yet still, masks have evolved to find their place into societies by fitting into their needs and beliefs. So where do masks fit in the current USA? Masks in the USA. After listening through all I've had to say, it's probably quite clear that masquerade balls have changed quite drastically between our modern context and the historical context of many other kinds of masking. When many people in the US think of masquerades, they think of something special, mysterious, and grand. It is the perfect theme for a corporate event or fundraiser. It is also very likely that when they think back to its original practices, they see their version of a masquerade imposed under the Carnaval de Venezia instead of what it once was. In my own experience, I remember seeing my parents dress up in their best attire with shiny masks attending fundraisers for my parents' work. For a while, when I was little as well, I had a small fixation on Italian masks, and when I got older, I wondered why it was. Of course, it was the distortion of media. The masquerades we see today are references to a part of the human past that doesn't have the context within the modern US society to effectively be portrayed. Masks in media. There are two pieces of media that have one scene in each that I believe began to lead us askew. Phantom of the Opera by Andrew Lloyd Webber and Labyrinth, 1986 movie. Phantom of the Opera. Other than the titular character and his iconic mask, there is an opening in the second act called Masquerade, where the company is having a grand New Year's celebration. This is a reference to the grand parties aristocrats in Venice threw. However, given that Phantom of the Opera was written in the 1980s and the book it was based on in the 1910s, specifically 1910, this means that this portrayed masquerade is far removed from its original Renaissance Venetian meaning. However, it does encapsulate the anonymity of Carnival. Labyrinth, another piece of media that is fairly well known. This hallucinated ballroom scene showcases a very haunting masquerade. Once again, this is a reference to Carnival, especially with the Western Europe focus on the eyes and an ensemble. Also, from the 1980s, and from the same year Phantom of the Opera was written, with a glamorized look at masquerades, which probably hint at a general consensus of what kind of masquerade look would best please the audience of 1980s Western society. I think both of these pieces of media capture what makes masquerade so interesting to us in the modern context, and that is how these masked parties spread so far. One reason it's part of tradition that is present in many other cultures, but that it's different enough to seem exotic and foreign and new and exciting. However, the US, there isn't a widely accepted tradition of masking in the country because of the fact that it was founded less than 250 years ago, and the majority of the population now are descendants from people who were not born on these lands. These portrayals of masquerades are reaching for a historic tradition to the distortion of time and just general dissonance. And while the craft is still known and familiar, it's been romanticized and changed to meet with the US's needs, which, if the research proves anything, it's that masking changes to fit into societies. Why the change happens. Masking is as old as human civilization. As a creation of civilization, it will change around us and mold to fit us just like any art form. To reiterate, the way that we think of masquerades is because there's a certain fetishization of them. Similar to how Austen novels have fetishized the Regency era, we think of masks as mysterious and exotic when they are just a part of culture from another place and time. References and conclusions. Masquerades are not what they used to be. Granted, this makes sense. They used to be in Venice, and now they're in the United States of America. However, they no longer represent the cultural norm that once was held in Venice for Carnival. But to some extent, this is okay. It is within the nature of masking to change and fit into the society in which it is present. And while there may not be a general tradition amongst the entire United States of America, I think we can all agree that there is something so intriguing about a masquerade ball.